Producer Price Indexes, December 2022. Transmission of material in this release is embargoed until 8:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Wednesday, January 18, 2023. The Producer Price Index for final demand declined 0.5% in December, seasonally adjusted, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics reported today. Final demand prices advanced 0.2% in November and 0.4% in October. See Table A. On an unadjusted basis, the index for final demand increased 6.2% in 2022 after rising 10.0% in 2021. In December, the decrease in the final demand index can be attributed to a 1.6% decline in prices for final demand goods. In contrast, the index for final demand services rose 0.1%. Prices for final demand less foods, energy, and trade services edged up 0.1% in December after increasing 0.3% in November. The index for final demand less foods, energy, and trade services advanced 4.6% in 2022 following a 7.0% rise in 2021. Final demand goods. Prices for final demand goods moved down 1.6% in December, the largest decrease since falling 1.8% in July. Leading the December decline, the index for final demand energy dropped 7.9%. Prices for final demand foods decreased 1.2%. Conversely, the index for final demand goods less foods and energy advanced 0.2%. Product detail. Nearly half of the December decrease in the index for final demand goods can be traced to a 13.4% decline in prices for gasoline. The indexes for diesel fuel, jet fuel, fresh and dry vegetables, canned, cooked, smoked, or prepared poultry, and basic organic chemicals also fell. In contrast, prices for carbon steel scrap increased 8.3%. The indexes for chicken eggs and for electric power also moved higher. See Table 2. Final demand services. Prices for final demand services edged up 0.1% in December after rising 0.2% in November. The December increase can be traced to margins for final demand trade services, which advanced 0.3%. Trade indexes measure changes in margins received by wholesalers and retailers. Conversely, the index for final demand transportation and warehousing services fell 0.2%, while prices for final demand services less trade, transportation, and warehousing were unchanged. Product detail. A major factor in the December increase in prices for final demand services was a 17.6% jump in margins for fuels and lubricants retailing. The indexes for deposit services, partial, airline passenger services, inpatient care, and professional and commercial equipment wholesaling also moved higher. In contrast, prices for truck transportation of freight decreased 1.7%. The indexes for residential real estate loans, partial, machinery and vehicle wholesaling, and guest room rental also fell. Intermediate demand by commodity type. Within intermediate demand in December, prices for processed goods decreased 2.8%. The index for unprocessed goods rose 3.4%, and prices for services increased 0.4%. See Tables B and C. Processed goods for intermediate demand. The index for processed goods for intermediate demand moved down 2.8% in December, the largest decline since falling 3.4% in April 2020. Over 80% of the broad-based decrease in December is attributable to prices for processed energy goods, which dropped 10.9%. The indexes for processed materials less foods and energy and for processed foods and feeds also moved down, 0.5% and 0.8%, respectively. In 2022, prices for processed goods for intermediate demand increased 4.7% after jumping 24.4% in 2021. Product detail. Nearly two-thirds of the December decline in the index for processed goods for intermediate demand can be traced to a 27.0% drop in prices for diesel fuel. The indexes for gasoline, basic organic chemicals, jet fuel, asphalt, and canned, cooked, smoked, or prepared poultry also moved lower. Conversely, Prices for electric power advanced 1.0%. The indexes for beef and veal and for primary non-ferrous metals also increased. Unprocessed goods for intermediate demand. Prices for unprocessed goods for intermediate demand rose 3.4% in December following 3 consecutive declines. Leading the increase, the index for unprocessed energy materials advanced 9.5%. Prices for unprocessed non-food materials less energy moved up 0.6%. In contrast, the index for unprocessed foodstuffs and feedstuffs fell 1.5%. In 2022, prices for unprocessed goods for intermediate demand moved up 11.7% following a 40.0% jump in 2021. Product detail. A major factor in the increase in prices for unprocessed goods for intermediate demand was the index for natural gas, which surged 45.3%. Prices for ungraded chicken eggs, carbon steel scrap, hay and hayseeds, slaughter turkeys, and aluminum base scrap also moved up. Conversely, the index for grains declined 5.9%. Prices for crude petroleum and for raw cotton also decreased. Services for intermediate demand. The index for services for intermediate demand rose 0.4% in December, the 6th consecutive increase. Over 70% of the December advance can be attributed to prices for services less trade, transportation, and warehousing for intermediate demand, which moved up 0.5%. The index for trade services for intermediate demand increased 0.6%. In contrast, prices for transportation and warehousing services for intermediate demand fell 0.1%. In 2022, the index for services for intermediate demand rose 6.4% following an 8.3% advance in 2021. Product detail. Over 40% of the December rise in the index for services for intermediate demand can be traced to a 16.4% increase in prices for deposit services, partial. The indexes for fuels and lubricants retailing, business loans, partial, gross rents for retail properties, paper and plastics products wholesaling, and airline passenger services also advanced. Conversely, prices for truck transportation of freight fell 1.7%. The indexes for investment banking and for chemicals and allied products wholesaling also decreased. Intermediate demand by production flow. Stage 4 intermediate demand. Prices for Stage 4 intermediate demand declined 0.3% in December following 4 consecutive increases. In December, the index for total goods inputs to Stage 4 intermediate demand fell 0.9%. In contrast, prices for total services inputs rose 0.3%. See Table D. Decreases in the indexes for diesel fuel, gasoline, grains, strawberries, canned, cooked, smoked, or prepared poultry, and portfolio management outweighed increases in prices for deposit services, partial, gross rents for retail properties, and electric power. In 2022, the index for Stage 4 intermediate demand moved up 6.0% after rising 12.6% in 2021. Stage 3 intermediate demand. The index for Stage 3 intermediate demand declined 2.1% in December, the largest decrease since dropping 5.4% in April 2020. In December, prices for total goods inputs to Stage 3 intermediate demand fell 4.5%. Conversely, the index for total services inputs rose 0.3%. Decreases in prices for diesel fuel, jet fuel, slaughter chickens, grains, raw milk, and truck transportation of freight outweighed advances in the indexes for deposit services, partial, ungraded chicken eggs, and hay and hayseeds. In 2022, prices for Stage 3 intermediate demand increased 4.9% after jumping 20.8% in 2021. Stage 2 intermediate demand. Prices for Stage 2 intermediate demand advanced 2.2% in December following 3 consecutive declines. In December, the index for total goods inputs to Stage 2 intermediate demand rose 3.5%, and prices for total services inputs increased 1.1%. Advances in the indexes for natural gas, deposit services, partial, fuels and lubricants retailing, business loans, partial, carbon steel scrap, and aluminum-based scrap outweighed declines in prices for crude petroleum, basic organic chemicals, and guest room rental. In 2022, the index for Stage 2 intermediate demand rose 8.7% after jumping 21.6% in 2021. Stage 1 intermediate demand. The index for Stage 1 intermediate demand declined 1.7% in December, the largest decrease since falling 1.9% in July. In December, prices for total goods inputs to Stage 1 intermediate demand dropped 3.2%. The index for total services inputs was unchanged. Decreases in prices for diesel fuel, basic organic chemicals, gasoline, grains, guest room rental, and investment banking outweighed increases in the indexes for gross rents for retail properties, fuels and lubricants retailing, and carbon steel scrap. In 2022, prices for Stage 1 intermediate demand advanced 5.5% following a 17.8% rise in 2021. The Producer Price Index for January 2023 is scheduled to be released on Thursday, February 16, 2023, at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.